You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to episode 359 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. If we think about all of the episodes we've ever had on this podcast, a big lesson we can take away from them is that people are complicated. This is a truism that holds in the past as well as in the present. Seldom do we ever find people where all of their actions and thoughts are black and white. What we see instead is that people are colorful because they aren't just one thing and they don't just act and think in one way. Now think about this colorfulness in terms of identity. How many people from the past have we met on this podcast who identified as being part of a town, a colony or state, a region, an empire, a nation, or any combination of those? And think about how many people we've met who strongly identified as members of a religious group or denomination. Or how many people have we met who viewed themselves as more than just one racial or ethnic category, such as they viewed themselves as both African and American, Indigenous and American, or as African, Indigenous, and American. And the same holds true for other aspects of human identities as well, aspects such as gender. Jen Manion, a professor of history and of sexuality and women's and gender studies at Amherst College, joins us to explore the early American world of female husbands, people who were assigned female at birth and then trains their gender at some point in their lives to live as men. Now, during our exploration, Jen reveals how early Americans understood and experienced ideas of gender and sexuality, information about female husbands as both a term and a category, and details about some of the people who transed their gender in the early modern period, including Deborah Sampson, Robert Shurtleff, Hannah Snell, James Gray, and Charles Hamilton, the first person who we know was called a female husband. But first, Ben Franklin's World has a listener-led and listener-driven book club. It's called Poor Richard's Book Club, and it was created by and is hosted by listeners just like yourself. Each meeting features a discussion of a new chapter from books we've discussed or will discuss on this podcast. Plus, the club's organizers, Shari and Heather, always bring in guests and readers just like yourself to lead each conversation. For more information about how you can join the Poor Richard's Book Club and meet up with fellow listeners, visit benfranklinsworld.com/book club. That's benfranklinsworld.com/book club. Are you ready to meet our guest historian? Allow me to introduce you. Joining us is a professor of history and of sexuality and women's and gender studies at Amherst College. Their research expertise is in the role of gender and sexuality in American life, and they've published 2 books, Liberty's Prisoners, Carceral Culture in Early America, which you may remember from episode 80, and, most recently, an award-winning book called Female Husbands, A Trans History. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Jen Manion.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Liz.
Jen, if you can believe it, it's been almost 300 episodes since we last had you on the show, which is when we spoke about your first book, Liberty's Prisoners, which is about carceral culture and prisons in early America. And now we're here to discuss your latest book, Female Husbands, which seems like a very different topic from prisons in early America. So would you tell us how your work and research concerning prisons in early America brought you to this topic of gender and sexuality in early America?
The through line is policing. And so the policing of people who are expressing gender or living and loving in ways that were frowned upon or not conventional for their time is a theme in both of my books. There was one case in Liberty's Prisoners. I got to meet someone who was incarcerated in Walnut Street Prison named Samuel Johnson. And they were assigned female at birth. And they were living as a man for several years, and they got arrested for burglary. And so it's actually one of the first records I found when I was doing research for my dissertation in the prison sentence dockets in Philadelphia. And it was about Samuel Johnson. And I thought, oh, wow, this is going to be a theme. This is going to be a pattern. I can't wait to learn more about how people like Samuel lived and what other people thought of them and how this kind of all went down. And then, of course, I never found another record at all like that in the rest of my research for that book. But that set me on a course to really explicitly target how people who were resisting gender norms, were transgender, lived in the 18th and 19th century and what happened when other people realized that someone was not who they thought they were. And unfortunately, that is usually how we learn about the lives of these people. It's because they were, quote unquote, caught, they were arrested, somebody turned them in and was very upset. And so the carceral state is still the common thread between my two books, for sure.
So finding this one person, Samuel Johnson, as you were researching policing and carceral culture in early America is really what caught your attention and opened the door to your new research project. It's like you found a pattern of policing.
It was a pattern that was not available in what I was looking at, which were the Pennsylvania prison records, right, of a specific era. But that doesn't mean that people like Samuel weren't living and weren't getting tangled up in the system. It's harder to find because sometimes people were not written about explicitly in those terms. Sometimes people were just arrested for vagrancy. And the official log didn't say more about what was the source of their vagrancy charge. But this is really like a function also of record keeping because the newspapers blew up these stories. And that's where you can find a lot more detail about a gender and sexual transgression.
Before we dig into the research that you've done for female husbands, I wonder if we could talk about the terms and terminology that we use today, especially when we're talking about people who lived in early America around the 18th and early 19th centuries. So let's talk about terms like gender and sexuality. Were these terms that people in early America would have been familiar with and understood? Are these just modern words for our own time that early Americans would have heard and not understood or have never heard them before?
That's a really important question. It's at the heart of the history of sexuality because the terminology has changed so dramatically over the centuries and people's understanding of sexuality also has changed so dramatically. So maybe I can better tell the story of the early period by explaining where our modern ideas came from. And that is in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. When doctors got involved in the study and diagnosis of people's gender nonconformity and same-sex attraction. So we generally refer to them as sexologists. And they really came up with this idea that if you had same-sex attraction, you were a specific kind of person, that was something innate to your being. It was, of course, a really bad thing in their eyes. There we see the roots of this idea even of homosexuality. So when you look at earlier records and people who were involved in same-sex relationships or having same-sex sex, for the most part, in the 17th and 18th century, people thought of that as just something that anyone might try, and that it was a sign that you were immoral, you were improperly churched. But it didn't signal that you were a specific kind of person who would only ever predominantly engage in same-sex intimacies or relationships. The history of transgender is even newer because the idea of transgender people as a distinct group, even from gay people, really comes out of the mid-20th century. And so what sexologists did is kind of lump us all together so that gender deviance, gender nonconformity, transing gender, same-sex love, we were all the same kind of person. So they definitely didn't strongly distinguish between what we think of now, where people who are gay or lesbian or bisexual and people who are transgender. So how do we bridge that time span to try to make sense of these lives and experiences in the 17th and 18th century? I think the most important thing that we do is to still recognize that people were doing these things. It was just not thought of as a core part of one's identity that made them distinct from straight people, or now people who we call cisgender.
We definitely seem to have more boxes to put people in today, and it seems like there were a lot fewer boxes to try and identify people in the 17th and 18th centuries, and possibly even the early 19th century.
I think so. As a person in the LGBTQ community myself, who's also really committed to understanding history as a tool for activism and social change now, I sometimes get tripped up in trying to articulate how somebody could have lived a trans life or lived a gay life in the 18th century, and whether or not they could have had peace, joy, contentment, and community on par with what some of us get to enjoy right now, even though there was still widespread social disapproval.
So, Jen, looking back at the 18th century, how would early Americans have understood sexuality as different from gender? Would they have seen a difference in these concepts?
Well, I think when we use the word gender, part of what we're referring to is the social. That's different from sex, so that everyone's assigned a sex at birth. We think of these maybe roughly as categories, male, female, and intersex, but that gender is what gives that classification meaning. And so it's how you move through the world. It's how you dress and express yourself. It's also, especially, let's say in the 18th century, it's about, for women, all the rights you don't have and all the freedoms you don't have by virtue of your gender. And of course, we know from the work of so many other important historians that gender is also highly racialized. For Black women in early America, they're even having access to fewer rights than most white women. And so gender is really playing out in the social sphere, in the political sphere, the economic sphere, education, in terms of access to power and privilege and autonomy. And so they might not have used the word gender in the way that we do, but it was very much an active dynamic that shaped and constrained people's lives. And also for men, and especially white men, and especially elite white men, opened up doors and created opportunities and freedoms. And when it comes to sexuality, one of the things that we do know is that the sexuality for white men in this era was pretty unrestrained. They could really do whatever they wanted without consequence. And when we think about other scholars of sexual violence in the period, we know that even when white men commit sexual assault, it's really only when they target women who are married or who have powerful fathers and who are white also, and who are going to make a fuss and say that's not okay, that there's consequence. So a lot of unrestrained sexuality for white men in the early era. And that also would have included people who were engaging in same-sex sex. So even though sodomy was against the law and it was socially frowned upon, there was a very high bar for the courts to actually convict somebody of sodomy. You had to have two independent witnesses, and the penalty was often death for much of the early period. And few people thought that white men especially should be executed for engaging in sodomy. Now, we know Black men's sexuality was regulated completely differently. And they were very vulnerable to often, even trumped up charges of sexual violence or sexual assault towards white women. And that also would have carried over to Black men who were engaging in same-sex sexualities with men. So there's just like a lot there.
Let's talk some more about these restrictions. As you said, gender in the 18th century, early 19th century was really about how a person moved through the world. And we know that early American society, when we think of its legal culture, was a fairly regulated place. I'm thinking of primogeniture, where the oldest males are always the ones to inherit the bulk of a family's estate. And then there's coverture, where a woman's legal identity was subsumed by their husband's legal identity. So Jen, were there other laws in place in early American society that regulated how someone could move through the world in terms of their gender and sexuality?
That's a great question. So both of those things were mostly regulated socially and economically and politically and by your family. So what we see is people who do transgender or cross-dress and who get caught and get in trouble for it, there's not a formal law specifically about it. People don't really know what to do. Some people find out that the person that they're hanging out with transgender and they don't care, they're fine with it. They're their friend, they respect and accept it. Some people freak out and they go to the police because that's like a new authority who's in charge of order. And the police usually don't even know what to do because they actually didn't break any laws. There were no laws explicitly against cross-dressing until the 1840s. And even then, very, very few. It really takes off in the 1870s. So people just get punished under these very general vagrancy statutes, which we know are used to like informally regulate any kind of minor disorder or disruption to a community. And the punishment is very modest. You're detained in jail for 30 to 60 days usually, and then you're released to go on your way and resume your life. The sodomy laws, which were really an import from the British Penal Code, were on the books from the earliest eras. And as I said, were very severe. The punishment was death, but there were very few prosecutions. It was rare to have prosecution. It was even rarer to have a conviction.
We often hear from guests on this podcast that the law was one thing in early America, and how it was actually applied on the ground in individual communities was quite another thing, that often communities didn't fully apply the law because it didn't suit their local interests. And it seems like the application of sodomy laws and the social restrictions on transing or cross-dressing really fell into this category of different communities would apply these laws in different ways that suited their own local needs.
Exactly. But that also doesn't mean that people aren't being harassed and bullied and assaulted and denied employment and denied friendship and denied community. All of those things happen to people who engage in same-sex relationships or who are transgender. But you're right, it's not happening at the level of the state.
Now that we have some terminology and context behind us so that we can better have this conversation and better understand the 18th century world, let's dig into the topic of female husbands. So Female Husbands serves as both the title of Jen's book and the subject of their book. Jen, would you tell us what female husbands are and who early Americans would have described as a female husband?
Yes, so female husband, for most of its usage in the 18th and 19th century, referred to someone who was assigned female at birth, and then usually sometime when they were a teenager, they transgender and they began living as a man. They worked as a man, they passed fully as a man, they got married to someone, and these are usually legal marriages that we actually can see and verify the marriage certificate for. And all of those people that I tracked who were referred to as female husbands were also white and working class. So this was very much a British laboring category used to describe this really specific group of people who did all those things that I just said. And it's used that way throughout the 18th and 19th century until the late 19th century. Then the word is sort of thrown around in the media to describe a lot of different kinds of experiences and a lot of different kinds of people. It loses its clarity and specificity, and then it kind of goes away. I mean, you'll see an anecdotal reference over the years, but as a go-to reference, which it is in the 18th and 19th century, it no longer is that.
So a female husband was someone who was assigned female at birth. they trans their gender at some point as a teenager, and then they passed as men. They lived, worked, and loved as men. Did you find any evidence of the reverse, where people who were assigned male at birth trans their gender so that they could be viewed within their community as women?
So there are a lot of records of people who we might think of as trans femme or trans women, or in some cases, gay men in the records, but they're never referred to with this kind of language. So they're really not male wives. But you do see a lot of different play on this gendered language and sometimes unusual categories and combinations of these terms in the press. That is one way that you can learn about these records, so that editors would say boy girl or girl boy or male girl or female boy, or they're trying to get the reader's attention, maybe to shock them, maybe a little bit sensationalized, and say, here's someone who doesn't neatly fit into the categories of man or woman that were most commonly written about in the media.
One of the best ways to find out about someone's identity is, of course, to get to know them a bit and then politely ask them, how do you prefer to be identified? And of course, one of the challenges of being a historian of the early American period is that we never get the chance to talk to the people we're studying. So Jen, what process did you go through as you did your research to figure out whether you could call someone a female husband in your book or not?
That's a great question. The most specific answer, the narrow answer to your question is, I only call people female husbands who were called female husbands at the time. And so that's what makes this a focused, meaningful category. It's actually because I didn't make it up, and I'm not just applying it to people who I think fit the criteria. So a lot of times people ask me about other cases of people who lived similar lives to female husbands, but not like exactly the way the category is defined. And they ask me if I think they were a female husband. And my short answer is no, because part of why I wrote such a narrowly focused book is that we actually need in-depth understanding about very specific kinds of experiences. And we need to stop just having this broad net to try to say, well, any kind of gender variance was all the same, because they weren't the same. My other answer to your question is nobody in the 18th century would have identified as a gender or sexuality. That's the whole point, is that really that whole concept of having an interior identity of one's homosexuality or heterosexuality or transgenderism is a 20th century invention. And so to me, that's the big fun part of trying to write this book, which is how did people understand themselves and each other before that concept of identity was constructed by doctors to really stigmatize and punish and regulate us?
That's really helpful for us to know that this category of female husbands was something that already existed in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And it's not a category that you, Jen, created, and you're not just applying it to anybody who would not have been identified in the historical record as a female husband. Now, one of the points that Jen makes in Female Husbands is that it's really difficult to find historical sources that reveal information or insight into people who would today consider themselves to be part of the LGBTQ identity. Jen, would you talk to us about why it's so hard to find stories of LGBTQ people in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, and what some of the ethics are that you have to grapple with as a historian in terms of what if you're in the historical record and you find a piece of information that might out somebody who was not actually outed in the past? Is it then ethical for you to reveal that information and out this person in our modern day?
I think the hardest part of working on this subject, especially the long ago past, is that we have very few records written by the individuals themselves describing their lives, their feelings, their fears, their vulnerabilities, their obstacles, their triumphs. So we love diaries as historians. They feel like some of the most important sources, some of the most powerful records that we have in the field, some of the most powerful work in our field comes from diaries and also personal letters between friends across time and space. Letter writing was such an important practice for so many reasons because of stigma and violence and judgment and loss of economic security. People who were queer or trans couldn't write openly about how they were feeling or what they were doing or the specificity of their lives. And so that's just all lost to us. One of the great set of records that we have about a lesbian from this time is Ann Lister. And people didn't even know until relatively recently because their amazing records in their diary were heavily coded. And it took someone really dedicated for many, many years to figure out how to break the code and then be able to understand what this 19th century lesbian was saying about her love and her relationships. And that's just tremendous. Like their life is the basis for the television show Gentleman Jack that completely changes how we're able to understand and think about somebody who would have lived a lesbian life, even if she didn't quote unquote identify, but she really just pursued and was involved with women her whole life. That's just so precious to have that kind of record. And unfortunately, most of the people who we learn about from the third person, and often court and prison records have been at the backbone of LGBTQ history of the 18th and 19th century forever. It still is, because that's the dominant way that the kinds of records that were saved that wrote about these people's lives. So they're incredibly mediated. It's a very negative situation. And we just barely have access or really any way of understanding people who weren't arrested. How many people were living queer and trans lives in this time and didn't get arrested and, had a friend group and had jobs and their families supported them? We just don't have any way to ever see those lives.
That's exciting and frustrating at the same time. Now, I wonder if you could help us better understand the records you have been using by telling us about one of the first female husbands who appeared in the popular press, and that was Charles Hamilton. Would you tell us about Hamilton, their life, and what their story reveals about early American understandings of gender, sexualities, and ways to live?
We learn about Charles Hamilton in 1746 when they were arrested. But we know that they were somebody assigned female who transgender and lived as a man. When they were a teenager, they got training to be a quack doctor to offer basic ointments and pills and modest forms of healing. And they traveled doing that work. They got involved with a young woman who was actually the niece of their landlord at the time. And the two got married. And several months into their marriage, Hamilton's wife ran to the authorities and said, "My husband is not who they thought they were. They're actually a woman. Get me out of this." And they took a deposition at the time, which actually still exists to this day. So we have the record of what Mary said to the authorities, which is a phenomenal record to read. And it became famous because Henry Fielding, who was, a struggling writer and who had relatives who were involved in the police state, learned about this case and wrote a fictionalized version of Charles Hamilton's life that sold well at the time. And it was really Henry Fielding who created this category or popularized the concept of a female husband to describe somebody who did those things. And then this phrase ends up kind of taking off and being used then by other writers and other reporters to refer to other people who were very similar to Hamilton and did similar things. Hamilton got punished. Again, it was a similar situation where they're not really sure what to charge them with, but it was deception and vagrancy, and they were incarcerated. And also this happened in England, and it was still when public punishment was popular. And so part of their punishment was not just to stay in prison, but also that they would be carted around to the 4 different towns where they were known to have lived and to be publicly whipped to show other people that this was a bad thing and that they should not do what Charles did. And if they did, that they would also be humiliated in this way.
So it sounds like Charles Hamilton was just out there living their life, and it was through the popular press that people first learned that Charles was a female husband. And you've told us a bit about how society chose to deal with Hamilton when it found out about their identity. But I wonder if you also found any evidence of whether the Anglican Church, the state church of England, got wind of Hamilton and then used religion as a way to weigh in on this topic and further regulate the way that female husbands could interact with and within society.
It's funny because it doesn't appear in the records, but that doesn't mean that it's not a very powerful force at play in the community and sort of demanding a certain accountability. In the case of Charles, the thing that really led to this terrible punishment, it wasn't so much the presenting as male, is that Charles presented as male, got legally married, and then had documented sex with their wife. Their wife actually describes in vivid detail their sex and why she was fooled, and that why for a certain period of time in their sexual encounters, they still believed that their husband was male. So this was a deception of a higher order than what you see female husbands getting charged with in the US. And it was really, in some ways, like analogous to some of the ways that lesbians would have been persecuted in this time for having sex and using other devices in order to do that for purposes of sexual pleasure. Sexual pleasure was something that men got to control. This was seen as the source of the threat.
Some of the stories that we have about people who transgendered in the early American period are those like Deborah Sampson or Robert Shurtleff, where you have someone who was assigned female at birth and then dressed as a man and enlisted in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. And then we also have plenty of evidence that there were women who dressed as men and took jobs as sailors on whaling and naval vessels. So Jen, let's take a moment to thank our episode sponsor, and then I think we should discuss why it seemed like so many people who transgendered in early America tended to gravitate to jobs that were either in the military or maritime in nature. Are you ready to commemorate Juneteenth? Consider coming to Colonial Williamsburg for a new event. To commemorate the triumphant spirit of the African American journey, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation will host a Juneteenth sunrise service on Sunday, June 18 at 6 a.m. The service will take place at the majestic Compton Oak on Market Square, as the Compton Oak is a landmark tree that symbolizes life, endurance, shelter, and joy. The ceremony will also include a special keynote address by visionary thought leader Tina Lifford. For more information about Juneteenth and commemorating the holiday here at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Juneteenth. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Juneteenth. Jen, why do you think people who felt like they wanted to transgender and did transgender in the early American period, why do you think they gravitated to jobs that were in the military or maritime services?
There's so many layers, so many different forces that shape people's lives. And I always think the first thing is people are really poor and have limited options, right? I mean, how many people in this era, especially people who are assigned female at birth, have access to education and careers? Like very few. And so when we think that like most people are laborers, they were enslaved, they were indentured, they were working poor people to begin with, then it starts to make sense. Like the maritime industry in this era is huge. It's a major way that a lot of people, right, are employed because of slavery and because of the trading goods. They were also always short. So you think about sailing and soldiering are two fields where there's never enough people. They're thought to be unskilled. We know that even though sailoring requires a lot of skill, that you can start as a green hand and kind of work your way up. So they're seldom represented in the trades and occupations where you would have had to apprentice with an older man who would teach you that trade, in part because in order to transgender and move through the world as a man, most of the people that I encountered had to leave home and had to run away to do that. They didn't have a father or an uncle, right, who was like, you know what, I'll train you alongside your brother in tailoring. So I think that's the biggest reason. They're also highly gendered occupations. No one thinks that a woman or someone assigned female at birth could be a good soldier because they thought so little of women's physical strength and capabilities at that time. Living on a boat is very hard. It's a hard life, and the work involved is very hard. The same thing with soldiering, so that if you do that, people aren't going to think that you're not who you say you are. So these highly gendered and sex segregated spaces sometimes do make it easier for people to pass and to thrive.
Speaking of highly gendered occupations, did you find any female husbands who pursued other occupations outside of the military or the maritime services that seem to also be gender affirming to them in their male identities?
Yes. Henry Stokes from Manchester, England, was a bricklayer and allegedly very successful and very talented in that kind of work. A lot of people worked in factories. So George Wilson, who was a female husband who first grew up working in the factories in Glasgow and moved to New York, and was working in New York City in the Lower East Side when they were caught by police who first thought that they were a sailor and then found out that they were working in the factory. So there is also range in terms of the occupations that people tried, and it might just be that maybe our question is, why do we know about so many soldiers and sailors? And why were those stories told?
That's a great question, Jen. Do we have an answer for that?
Well, what do you think?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because we do have these stories of Deborah Sampson or Robert Shurtleff and other stories like James Gray or Hannah Snell, which really reflect that female husbands or people who were born female and transgendered to male were serving in military jobs and as soldiers. And I wonder if, to illustrate this point, if you could tell us about James Gray or Hannah Snell and possibly even about Samuel Bundy and how they made their ways through life.
Yeah, so those are 18th century British sailors. And one of the reasons that I included them in this book, even though they weren't female husbands, is that they were also people who were assigned female, who transgender and lived as men and worked as sailors. And then also sometimes in that era, being a sailor also made you a soldier because you were in the British Navy, which was true for a couple of the cases. And I included them because the stories that were written about their lives included really vivid detail about how other people made sense of them once they found out that they were assigned female at birth, and how other people thought it was possible for someone who they saw as a woman to live as a man. And so they described how they dressed, how they carried themselves, different parts of their embodiment in vivid detail, how they interacted with other people, who they dated, how they flirted. And I believe these stories from the 18th century, from these British soldiers, in many ways were the template that was used. Someone I usually call Robert Shurtleff, because that was the name that Deborah Sampson took when they were like, I'm going to live as a man and work as a soldier, call me Robert Shurtleff. Then when people try to understand this early revolutionary American story, they're looking back and borrowing from the stories of the British sailors and soldiers before them. And then this knowledge keeps accumulating. So writers and editors who then go on to present female husbands are also drawing on these traditions. And I know it because they usually name them. Right. So at the end of a story of a new person, a new female husband, oftentimes at the end, they'll list a bunch of names. This was just like what Robert Shurtleff and James Gray did before. And so it's one way that we can grapple with how did these stories really just fill the public imagination and lots of pages in this era. So they were stories that a lot of people would have been familiar with. And then what kind of editorial decisions and changes are made in the 19th century to distinguish their attitude from earlier eras.
I'd like to talk about these editors and print culture, but to go back to our question of why so many trans people may have pursued soldier and sailor career paths, an interesting part of why we have so many stories of people like Robert Shurtleff is because they had to live and work in such close proximity with each other on a nearly 24/7 schedule. It's not like they could go home from the factory or home from the brickyard and in the privacy of their own homes act as they'd like to act. In these military and maritime environments, you're living on a ship, you're living in an army camp, and everyone's watching you all of the time. So perhaps that's why we have so many stories of people transing gender in these kinds of occupations.
Yeah, it's incredible because given those variables, you're much more likely to get caught. And that could be why we have the stories.
Now, in Female Husbands, Jen notes that the stories and reports we have of people who transgendered were not kept as isolated community secrets that Jen just happened to find in an archive. These were stories that were broke in the press as international news. These were stories that appeared in both English and American newspapers. Jen, what other forms of print culture did you find while doing your research that revealed evidence and stories of female husbands? We talked a bit about Charles Hamilton and how newspapers broke their story, but were stories of female husbands something early Americans could read about in pamphlets and books as well, or did you only find evidence of female husbands in stories reported in newspapers?
One of the things that drew me to female husbands and led me to decide that I really need to focus on them and elevate them is they're all over the newspapers, and then they're way underrepresented in pamphlets and books. So all the soldiers and sailors have so many pamphlets and books all throughout the 18th and 19th century. So what is it about those stories that is seen to have a broader reach and more profitable than female husbands who are all over the newspapers, but really only sporadically represented in pamphlets? James Allen was a huge case in London, and maybe we have a broadside and two pamphlets, an expensive, full color, thick paper pamphlet, and then a cheap pamphlet. And lots of them didn't get pamphlets or books that survived. So why?
That's an interesting question. Now, thanks to modern day Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, we have an idea that British print culture is very different from American print culture. And I wonder, Jen, as you think back to all the historical records that you found, did you find a predominance of outing people and sensationalizing their story in the British press as compared to the American press? And is the American press compared to colonial American presses and then the presses of the early Republic United States?
It's very clear that the British press spent more column inches on these stories and reported them in much greater detail than the American press did. But I was surprised to find that the British press was in many ways more respectful and affirming of the manhood of the husbands than the American press was. Then the American press was more derogatory and mocking. And that's not to say that the British press wasn't also mocking, but there was also, I think, a real sincere view, especially in the 18th century, that sure, it was totally reasonable and possible for someone assigned female to live and work as a man, that just made sense. And then they're just kind of thinking and talking through, how did they do it? Did anybody ever suspect? What does that mean for us? And I think in the case of James Howe, especially somebody who's written about potentially the most in both the British press and the American press over the course of 100 years, the early reporting of them is quite respectful and laudatory about what a great community member they were, what a great husband they were. In many ways, I think part of the reason for the way they framed James Howe was this is kind of what all British laboring men should be like, that Howe is almost like presented this model.
When you think back on all the research that you found about female husbands, what kind of conclusions were you able to come to about queer and gender nonconforming life in early America?
That's a great question. I found that the medicalization of gender and sexuality, which occurred roughly in the 1880s into the early decades of the 1900s was a really destructive force for us and people who would become the LGBTQ community that we still haven't recovered from. And even though it's apples and oranges to try to compare what's it like right now to be a trans queer person in 2023 versus what was it like to be a trans queer person in 1865, because everything about those historical contexts is so incredibly different. I think there was a certain freedom of possibility and fluidity for people living in the 18th and 19th century that if someone recognized, oh, you're someone who is gender nonconforming, or you're someone who transgender, or you're someone engaged in same-sex relationships, that didn't instantly lead to a judgment, a stigma that you're inferior and that you have a mental disorder that you need to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist to try to repair. That paradigm did not exist yet. And so in that respect, I walk away with this abundance of evidence about people living queer trans lives through hardship and also joy, with isolation and also love, but without the stigma that medicine created for us. And it's actually inspired my next project, which is to think about medical stigma and how destructive that force has been in the shaping and limiting of queer and trans identity in the 20th and 21st century.
Jen, what is the one thing that you'd really like for us to walk away from our conversation better understanding and remembering about those who transgender in early America?
It doesn't matter why they did it.
Okay. And now we should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, Jen, what might have happened if all the individuals you identified as female husbands, those people who had been outed in the press, had been allowed to continue living their life and the gender they felt most comfortable with?
It would be tremendous. And I think what would have happened is that those individuals and their loved ones and friends could have been happy if the larger forces of religion and social norms and economic imperatives didn't motivate people to punish and harass them and not let them live their lives. And I think at the very least, it might have prevented medicine from getting in the business of stigmatizing us and creating an illness that only they could cure. If there was widespread acceptance that people would not have tolerated that move on the part of medicine, and everything about LGBTQ life and equality and possibility and liberation in the 20th century could have been different.
You previewed a bit earlier that your next research project is on medical stigmatization. Would you tell us more about that research project?
This era of sexology is really important in the history of sexuality, and a lot of people have done important work on it. I think what motivated me to think about the legacy of stigma and medical injustice, it's really two different things. I think one is how they start to write about female husbands and other trans and queer people in the late 19th century in a way that's unrecognizable and so stigmatizing. And they take people who were minding their own business and who in an earlier era might have been arrested for vagrancy and detained for 30 days, and they institutionalize them in mental hospitals for decades. And they present that as a gift that they're offering us the opportunity for treatment to be changed. And so this field that both created our illness and then presented themselves as our only hope for cure has been so destructive. And we have yet to fully understand and comprehend the legacy of turn of the century sexology and psychiatry and how that still is shaping LGBTQ lives and health and love and freedom today.
Jen, if we have more questions about the different topics we've been talking about today, and as they relate to early America, where should we get a hold of you? Where can we contact you?
People can email me at jmanion@amherst.edu. I'm also on Instagram at ManionJen.
Jen Manion, thank you for rejoining us and for taking us through the history of female husbands.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's been a pleasure.
Then, as now, we can see that people of early America and of early modern Britain struggled to find language and categories to define people who did not conform their behavior to the gender norms expected of them. Now, although Jen stressed that it does not matter why a person trains their gender, we did spend a fair amount of our conversation trying to understand the context for why living as a man may have been preferable to living as a woman in the early modern period. Gender very much defined how people lived and moved in the early modern world. Gender reflected how someone dressed and expressed themselves. It also defined all of the rights that they had or did not have access to. As Jen related, elite white men could open political, economic, and educational opportunities and freedoms for themselves and their families just because they were white men. The male gender had and still largely has this power even in our own time. On the other hand, for white women, doors to political, educational, and economic advancement were often shut to them simply because they were women. And of course, these doors to opportunities and freedoms become even more restrictive when you add racial and ethnic identities to the mix. Now, another interesting point to consider from our conversation is how seemingly less concerned the people of early modern Britain and the early United States were with policing gender. As Jen noted, there weren't laws on the books against cross-dressing or laws that punished gender nonconformity. If towns wanted to punish someone for gender nonconformity, then they had to use the vague charge of vagrancy, just as they did for Charles Hamilton in 1746. And as we can see from Jen's research into the press, many in the 18th century recognized that it was possible for women to trans their gender and live as men. At the same time, the possibility for women to trans their gender and live as men did not mean those that transed their gender lived peaceful lives. Living as a person who was transing their gender always came with the fear of being caught, and being caught could mean assault, discrimination, and living a life in family or community-imposed isolation. And yet, even with this fear, people still transed their gender in the early modern period. Look for more information about Jen, their book, Female Husbands, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/359. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Joseph Edelman, Holly White, and Ian Tonat. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, as we said, people are complicated. So what other complexities would you like to explore as we investigate the world of early America? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.